So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Suzanne Brown. I'm the Director of Community and Government Affairs and Staff Liaison for our Global Council. Thanks for joining us for our inaugural series of our Global Real Estate Series that we are kicking off. Today we have with us Bobby Brush. He is a broker with Vacasa. I want to say real estate, but Vacasa Real Estate Office. And he's here to talk to us today about the short-term rental industry. That's the area that his company specializes in. Bobby has a lot of experience with it. And his company deals with the short-term rental industry in multiple states. And you do have, I believe I've heard before that you have your own attorney background that you can that legal side.
Not attorney. I went to law school. There's
you went to law school. Okay, that's what I'm like.
There's
what
a big difference between the two.
But so you have some of that background, but just lots of experience in the industry, and especially how it relates to our international practitioners, because we do have a lot of our global investors that seek out short-term rental opportunities. Well, with that, I'm going to turn this over to Bobby and let you take it away.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Suzanne. So it looks like we have a couple. It's Jan, and then is it Armarino? Am I saying that right? I am? Okay, perfect. Well, perfect. So what I'll do, kind of the point, since we're getting started just a little later, I'll condense some of the things I was going to talk about, which will be good, be a little more streamlined. But kind of to Suzanne's point, so I'm the broker here in Arizona as well in Washington for Vacasa Real Estate. Vacasa is the largest vacation rental management company, if you will, in the North America. So we have about 29,000 homes. And again, these are all private investors that own these properties from all over the country, all over the world. And so I think this is why it kind of ties into what this series is. Well, obviously the biggest impact that I think a lot of folks have seen here in Arizona, and I'm going to speak specifically about Arizona and then Scottsdale as well, within that is the huge shift in purchasing when it comes to these properties, what's available and just some of the demand. And I think, it's good to have a smaller a group, largely because it's kind of indicative of the market. This is a very niche role, if you will. I mean, and so one things that we've been doing is working with more investors that want to purchase, because it's becoming a lot harder to find properties. And so having that expertise of being able to identify properties is critical for how competitive the landscape is. But just to give some examples on the size of and I'll try to share his if I can. I want to make sure that so tell me here, Suzanne, if it's
So if you scroll down to do your options should pop up for share screen.
Yep.
And then just select the one. There you go.
Okay, perfect. Is it just one that's showing?
Yes, we have the right screen.
So the one things here that I would talk about is just some of the snapshot of the industry. And really, again, this was made for a little bit different, larger group, but this is fine. It says, the investment home market, there's 1.8 million investment homes. I don't know if people recognize that piece to it. When it comes to the short-term rental, it's about a $40 billion deal in the United States. All right, so when I look at what are some of the opportunities here in Arizona specifically, it's fueled in part by an agent, what I would call an expert agent network. So folks that are specific to short-term rentals and/or have a piece of that in their repertoire, so to speak. And there is a lot of prospective vacation rental marketplace and realtor participation. So this is really kind of the crux of today. But I think there's a few things that would be important to understand about short-term rentals in Arizona specifically. So this all is based upon our economy here in Arizona, which is called the sharing economy. This is a big piece to the, I would say, the motive of why vacation rentals are allowed here, and in a way that they're not really allowed in a number of other states, as I think most folks recognize that work with the local governments here, often to the chagrin but it's also something that we have to deal with. I'll talk about that here in a minute. But there is a huge trend of folks that are buying properties, but also as co-families or co-owners that are buying properties. It's really kind of a unique piece. So multiple families buying one property for their own use, and then when they're not there, asking someone to purchase or manage the property. A couple, I would just say, misnomers that would be good to clear up, because I think building credibility in short-term rental industry space, so to speak, is super important when it comes to folks. Most people that you'll be dealing with or would be dealing with, or we do, have some knowledge of short-term rentals. So walking into that, I would say with some level of understanding of the market is critical in building that credibility. Number one, this is not a timeshare. So I hope that's one thing that we all understand. These are individual properties owned by individual owners or some entity that owns them. So homes and condos obviously are the majority of the property that we manage. You know, it's also vacation rental is the same as short-term rentals. Sometimes people only want to do executive rentals, whatever those are effectively synonymous. Sometimes people think those are different things, and they're not. The reason that they're classified here differently has to do with tax and laws. We won't get into that piece to it. But laws and ordinances are really important here in Arizona, for example. And I think wherever you do these throughout the country or even throughout the world, it's important to know, take the temperature of the area that the short-term rental is in, and to know what those are. HOAs right now here in Arizona, for example, HOAs would be the, pardon me, would be the most important governing factor from short-term rentals perspective. And we'll talk about that here in a minute when we're talking about dealing with sellers or buyers purchase property, pardon me. Airbnb and VRBO, which seems to be the common nomenclature that most investors will use, is, hey, will you buy me an Airbnb? Or, hey, I'm looking for an Airbnb. Just to ensure it's that's common nomenclature, because a lot of folks don't understand, but that would be a short-term rental. Just to be clear though, Airbnb and VRBO are the quote unquote 800-pound gorillas in the space, but they really are marketing. So for a better way to connect it, it would be like they are the MLS of vacation rental properties, but they don't actually have the properties themselves. That would be managers like us. But just for perspective, because of the size and scale of our company, we would be Airbnb's largest customer, because all of our properties are managed, or probably not managed, but are marketed on Airbnb and VRBO. One other thing too, and Suzanne knows this, is the vacation rental companies are, at least ours is, and a number of them are that are operating well, are members of the MLS, right? So sometimes it's almost like it's tough to walk that line, because we want successful vacation rental properties, but we don't want them to change, put MLS in a tough spot, or realtor association tough spot, because they're not operating well, and you might get people that are upset with the way that they might change the neighborhood if they're not being managed correctly. But it is important to understand that here in Arizona, for example, I'm a member of SAAR, TAR, and AAR in all the spaces that we operate. It's important to have that realtor network, and it always has been for us. And so those are some of the trends. But here's some of the numbers that I think is important to recognize, is that here in Arizona, we've had a monster year, so to speak, when it comes to purchasing and it comes to revenue, which has really been kind of the inverse. Arizona and Florida have really been kind of the inverse, if you will. Did it stop sharing? Oh no, it's still sharing. Okay, good. Kind of the inverse here of what you would call happen in the rest of the world or the rest of the United States. We saw year-over-year growth throughout our portfolio of 7%. In Arizona, our year-over-year bookings and growth is up 30%. So that's significantly different than all the markets that are north of the 45th parallel. So we're seeing a ton of investors come from Seattle, from Chicago, from New York, Boston, folks from all of California has a huge influx. And many of these folks that have come to stay, or pardon me, have come to, well, stay during the pandemic because they work remotely, are now purchasing and have been purchasing. And that's obviously fueled a lot of the upward trend, if you will, in price. Now, when it comes to US user growth, just for example, and we'll talk about this for a second, is the US number growth over time has increased significantly. And there's reasons for that, I think, which we'll talk about here in just a second when I wrap this up, but you can just see the steady growth. Even with the pandemic, the growth numbers over time are going to continue to grow. And then market penetration, which I think this is extremely important. So we have a lot of data because we manage a lot of properties across the large space, because we are the largest in North America, but we also have a lot of properties in Europe, a lot of properties in South America, a lot of properties in Southeast Asia that we manage. So we're a global company as well. But if you look at really your percentage of users by age group, I think this is important to recognize, because wherever you're at, whether it's Scottsdale, and even within parts of Scottsdale, it can be very socioeconomically driven in terms of who your renter looks like. And that's important if you're going to try to get somebody to have the confidence in purchasing these properties. Most people own somewhere between 1 and 3 properties. Usually you don't see a lot of individual owners go more than 3, but the lion's share is one property that people own. So this is something that a lot of them would need a lot of help with. But you can see obviously the group that most use it. This is, I would call it the Uber group as well. I mean, folks that are much more comfortable with the sharing economy, and that's critical to recognize. Not only in purchasing the property type, but also in how you furnish it. Furnishings it's a startup cost, just like any other business, and things that would need to be considered when you're working with a client. So we talked about driving the growth. Obviously, technology is a huge piece in scalability. And I would say one of the reasons, for example, that's important for us to work with realtors and MLSs and local associations is that even though, for example, if you were to go on Airbnb and you're going to go on even our website where we're getting quite a few bookings, and there's this consolidation of management technology, the on the ground managing. So the people that are turning properties, the people that are housekeeping, dealing with guests, that's always going to be a localized operation. It's just too difficult to make it third party, so to speak, from a remote distance. And I think that's a big piece to why it's important. You want to work globally or work internationally, or if you want to work, domestically, you still need to find good people on the ground to work with. Here's a couple things that I think are important when you're talking about overseas for us. So 21% of all vacation rental properties are in the United States and 60% are in Europe. I don't know if people recognize that, but there's reasons for that. Now, the size of the properties are much different in Europe than they are here in the United States, right? The size or the footprint of the properties are much larger, generally speaking, here, but there's also a lot more fluidity to the movement in Europe. At least there's been historically in that sharing economy. That's where it pretty much started. There's over 7 million hosts on Airbnb, 220 countries. And the number thing about this is that every night there could be up to about 2 million people staying in a short-term rental. At least it's the Airbnb statistics, which are a fraction of the market. So that number could be, or is quite a bit higher. Now here's kind of why with realtors it's important, and this is why we're also a property manager and a realtor member, is there's 23,000 vacation rental companies in the United States, and then there's 115,000 in the world. But look, if you look at how this breaks up, and this is where, if you're a realtor and you're working with folks in the area that you work in, is try to create relationships with the short-term management company. Because a lot of them, the majority of them, are going to be smaller boutique companies that actually do the on-the-ground management. So 70% of these are only managing 1 to 19 units, right? And this usually management is third party when they're seeing management. Usually they're not talking about owner-occupied management. 20% obviously is no more than 99 units, and then there's a few of the larger ones that are only make up 10% of the marketplace. So I think the reason this is important is it really shows the localized requirement, or at least demand, for vacation rental management, and why it's so important to work with realtors, if you will, at the local level, who have all the resources. And I think Suzanne can even speak to this. I mean, there's been a ton of resources and benefits for my involvement for our own company to work with the Scottsdale Area Association of Realtors, for example, as well as other ones throughout the state, that we would not have anywhere near the amount of information and data and resources if we were just on our own. Obviously, technology is a huge piece to it that's changing. Dynamic pricing. I mean, those are things that I think are recognizing when you work with with folks that want to buy. They're always going to ask you, how much money can my property rent for? How much money is it going to make a year? What are the different, here in Arizona, for example, seasonality is huge. It's very huge. Here, the occupancy we've seen has stayed up. We're about 70, 80% throughout the year. But even in the summer times, occupants will stay up. I've always said you can keep a property full. It's just a function of what the price is you're going to rent the property for. And then there's a lot of smart home systems, and I'm sure all of us are familiar with that. It has to do with e-locks, getting into properties, has to do with centralized information for utility expenses and controls, things like this that otherwise weren't available even 10 years ago when you were giving people hard keys, physical keys to get in and out of properties. NAR came out with this article. I don't know if you can see it all that well, but it did talk about how this back in 2020 during the summer that there was a 44% gain in sales nationally when it came to short-term rentals. So there's been a ton of push upward trend on just national. So Arizona's been kind of at the forefront of it, but even nationally, there's a big move for short-term rentals space. Pandemic was driving that, remote working, but also just, I would say, the buyer pool. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. I don't want to jump in front of it. So obviously here, these are the way the statistics break down, and this is going into 2020. So it might have a little bit of variance, but millennials are more likely to use mobile devices and digital platforms, which many of these things are obviously on, and maybe some of you guys have seen or been on the platform and rented. But they're going to spend, and I think a lot of them are much more willing to spend, although the what you would call the more advanced age group is spending quite a bit more money in the space, as well as being much more technologically involved. Now, the one thing that we have seen, this is one trend, and it'll be interesting, it's starting to loosen up a little bit. It has to do with the travel trend. During the pandemic, and I think there's even a little bit more of it, is we've seen a lot of fly-to markets. So when you're flying to Hawaii or you're flying even across country to those destination markets, some of those have struggled. The drive-to markets are the ones that have seen the biggest growth. That's why Phoenix, being a drive-time market from Colorado, from California, even parts of the western U.S. has seen so much growth. I think that'll loosen up as people get a little more comfortable with flying again. But that's something to always think about, is who's your target market going to be when you rent the property, because that's always going to relate to purchasing the property, right? You can buy a great property in a good location, but if you can't fill it up, investors are going to know that. So this is one thing that we always pitch to our investors is, here's who your target market is. That's how we're going to get the rents. That's how we're going to get the percentage of occupancy, which is critical. We won't jump into that. The Gen Z, this is the group that's even younger. And one thing that I thought was unique that pulled out of it is that 81% of our Gen Z folks here have already stayed in a vacation home, cabin, or condo. So in other words, part of the older group, I always talk about my parents. My parents 5 years ago would have never rented a vacation rental. My dad has a different mentality. He didn't think it would be, he thought it was a bit unique to rent other people's homes. Now he has one himself that he rents out, and he only stays at vacation rental properties as they travel nowadays. So I think some of that was readjusting or realigning some expectations. However, the upcoming generations, so many of them are already familiar with it. It's a way different learning curve. And I think that's one reason you're going to see a ton of growth or continued growth in that space. Obviously, COVID had a big impact here. The $88 billion is what the projected revenue. That's obviously up 18% over time. And we won't get into a bunch of these statistics, although I can always send out the deck if you guys want. You can look at some of these things that we have and that our company has been able to produce. But just to put this in perspective, and then we'll talk about maybe working with some buyers and sellers, things to consider. But this is a massive space. So for example, even though we're the largest vacation rental management company with 30,000 homes, we're still less than 3% of the market in the United States. So there is a ton of properties out there. There's a ton of opportunity, and there's a ton of folks that still have properties that are vacation rentals or second homes that, depending on where they're going to work, could easily be transitioned into certain markets. And I think this is largely trying to connect globally, as well as with other realtors out of area where, again, just recognizing a lot of folks own properties in areas that they don't live primarily. One thing that I always have to point out when I'm doing presentations on this is you just have to be aware of the local, wherever you're at on the ground again, and understand that there is the flip side of this, which is, again, how are you going to deal with owners or prospective purchasers or concerns when they're looking into areas, they're going to spend $1 million or a couple $1 million or even 500,000, whatever the magic number is. And they're going to see these articles and go, well, what does this mean for me? How is this going to affect my purchasing? Arizona's been kind of at the forefront of this. I mean, in terms of how they're going to deal with the state, how they're going to deal with the local cities. And there's no right answer to this other than to stay vigilant, try to operate in a way that I think one of the biggest problems that we always run into is with the stigmatized idea that all vacation rental properties are nuts. But if you look here at this right one where there's beer cans or there's whatever it is, that's an anomaly, right? So that's less than, I would say, less than 0.5% of all the vacation rental properties that exist here in the space. So it's a reality that you always have to kind of look at. I was just talking to an investor. He goes, "Well, what do you think is going to happen in the next 3 years?" Well, I don't have a crystal ball, so we just go with the best information that we have. But you have to be real about the risk of if things change. One thing I thought would be interesting to just recognize here is that of the investors of short-term rentals and the vacation buyers, is over half of them and 60% buy single-family residences. The average or the median square footage of these vacation rental properties is about 1,500 square feet. Obviously there's ones that own huge ones and they do quite a bit of business. They're also a little more, have a higher proclivity to having parties. That's always one big thing to think about. But most of the properties are not massive properties. Most of them are going to host between 2 and 4 people, and for a stay time of between 3 to 6 days. That's one of the big things we've seen in Arizona purchase-wise. I think whatever market you're in, you got to look at and see, well, what's the use? And we'll talk about that with the buyers here in a second. But I saw the Wall Street Journal article. I don't know if you guys saw that. It said here in Phoenix. Now this is not vacation homes. Take this out of here. Is that in 2020 that there was over 2,300 properties purchased that were over $1 million in the Phoenix area, and that's twice as many than were in 2019. So that's a function of upward trend in price, but also just the demand level is at, I would say, well, a couple of things. One is I think the availability of real estate was a lot more prevalent on that end, but recognizing who your buyer is going to be is, and the space they're going to be most likely interested in is important. Half of them have to generate income. So when you're working with local agents, I think when you're doing any type of referral or globally, wherever you're at, is you got to figure out how are you going to know what the property is going to generate. That's not easy. That's a very tough ask. But there's information out there and there's people you can work with, because 45% of them, give or take, almost half of them, they need to cash flow in order to make the payment. Right. So some of them will buy all cash, and there's certainly that space out there, but half of the buyers in the market right now are getting loans. And if they can't cash flow or at least break even, and a lot of them will admittedly say, well, if I can stay there for a little bit of time and I break even, then I'm okay with that. But they can't lose money. And so obviously being able to predict, or at least to give some revenue estimates that show that it at least breaks even or they make a little money is critical. And if not, that kills deals all the time. So I mean, working with buyers and sellers, I think are recognized. One thing that we've done with all the data, we kind of break into who are the people we're dealing with. So real estate buyers, in our perspective, and even owners, really break down into 3 different areas. There's always a savvy investor, and I think most of us recognize who that is. There are people who are familiar with across the board, not just investments, real estate, but across the board. And they want to make informed decisions. That's kind of what we just talked about. There's the cap rate. There's different types of financial metrics that we want to put in front of them, and we can, if you guys have questions. There's the affluent professional. This is where I think the biggest opportunity is right now for most realtors. People that we see, realtors that we work with a ton of realtors that end up referring business to us, and we refer the sale back to them. But these are the doctors, these are the lawyers, these are the people that have been working in tech for several years, and these are the folks that are buying right now. And they're the ones that have a little bit of money, a nest egg built up to purchase. They're selling stocks. They're selling different types of other investments to get into this property that they want. And those are the best type for realtors, because A, the people have money, but B, they need a lot of help. They need a lot of help identifying the property. They need a lot of help gaining confidence that the property will do well. So just educating them on the space, as well as finding the right property. That's where realtors can absolutely bring a ton of value to that type of buyer, which is the prevalent buyer in today's world. The dream planner, that one's a tough person to work with. These are the people that usually need the loan right now. They need the loan, and those, as I'm sure those of you that are in the space understand, that offers are coming in dozens. I mean, we do Flagstaff. Flag is just as busy as here. I mean, property that we were working on a month ago had 74 offers on it. You know, so that's very tough when you put an offer in front of somebody and you're saying, I need 30 days due diligence. I need to make sure my loan works, versus someone that's all cash, closing 5 days, no inspection, right? So the dream planner, a little tougher to work with right now. It's pretty much people that are locked and loaded with cash can close. That's where we're seeing probably 70% of the market and buyers for investment properties. So we're not going to jump into the drill down into these individual people, which we have the data though, because it's important. But here, I'll just point out some of the amenities that are important of what people look for when they purchase. And it's good to know this before you hand off or you're working locally, because this can help identify, make sure that you recognize what's important. So the one thing I think we all have to recognize is, since people that are purchasing are usually going to purchase properties they would stay in themselves, that's the very first thing to recognize. They're very rarely does someone come in and say, yeah, if it was me, I'd stay in a mansion, but let's go ahead and buy a 2-bed condo. That's usually not the way it works, or vice versa. And we have a bunch of search results. So just like Google has search results that helps form people's opinion, our position is we have quite a bit of information. And here's the things that what people search for, right? So even if they don't book, we still know what they plugged into. Here's what we're looking for. Here's our prospective purchase, or here's our prospective property you want to stay at. Both of them are somewhat equivalent. Obviously, bathrooms is the most important part. I say obviously because with a lot of new owners, people say, well, let me get a 4-bed, 2-bath. I would never suggest 4-bed, 2-bath, even though certain markets you get stuck, you know, that's your opportunity. I mean, 3-2 or 4-2.5, 4-3, these matter, especially when you're trying to figure out what property is better than another. But bathrooms is more important than bedrooms when it comes to ratios. Then bedrooms, size, location, the demos. Obviously, a lot of folks now, I don't know if many of you guys do this, but when we do data, a lot of folks, when they rent and they're going to spend a significant amount of money, oftentimes they're going to do additional research in the area. What are the average home prices? What are the average rents in other places? There's a lot more research that goes on, I think, than most people recognize on the buyer side, as well even on the resident side. The other thing, the single biggest thing here in Arizona, for example, is properties with hot tubs, or they call them spas or hot tubs. I mean, it's just one little tidbit. Will rent better than properties that have pools, which is really unique to think about. And we won't get into all of that, but just the idea here is that if given, this is a, for example, of local realtor bringing value. You have properties that we all the time don't have a pool, don't have a hot tub. Owner thinking about putting a hot tub or putting a pool in, and we would suggest that if given the opportunity, or given the idea that you could choose between either, a hot tub is much more, you know, you would call it return on your investment, much better way to spend money. But that's, again, depends on who you're dealing with. But by and large, that's the way it works. So a couple factors though when you're working with this, and then I think this will be the last one we'll finish up with and see if you guys have any questions. But obviously you have to be able to determine, is the property viable? And there's some tools out there. I don't know if there's Mashable's one of them, Air DNA is one of them. Our company actually has one that we put a lot of data into that people can put in there, but they can put in addresses that then will give the historicals, but really what's the forward-looking 12 months look like. They get that data by what are the existing bookings in the area. You can get that data to your buyers by what are the properties currently being offered at, the competing properties being offered at is $1,000 a night or $500 a night, and then what's actually been booked at those rates moving forward. So a lot of it's projection. A lot of it is getting to know the market well enough to add that value. And then, you know, figuring out what those cap rates are when it's all said and done based upon the cost of purchase. What I would say the next thing to do if you're advising a client is always look at kind of what I would say a fallback plan. Is it a good short-term rental? Okay, if the answer is yes right now, short-term rentals go sideways. Could it be a long-term rental? Scott still has a lot of those metrics as well. For example, a lot of properties that are short-term rentals could be very good long-term rentals, which historically have a larger demand than short-term rentals, or at least a more inelastic demand. And then finally, that same property before you purchase it, is there enough underlying value that if, hey, I got to bail because this thing's not making enough money, could there be some built-in long-term value, or at least it's not going to take the same hit? A lot of people right now are asking me, is this a bubble? Is the price increase a bubble? I don't think it is. And there's a number of reasons, I won't get into it, but I don't think it is. I think demand and supply is a huge one. So I think that there is the ability to sell if need be, because neither one of those fit the criteria. After someone buys it and they go, just for statistic purposes, the average person owns a short-term rental somewhere between 18 and 36 months, right? So wherever that is, who knows? I mean, a lot of them are investors that are putting money somewhere, but recognize that there needs to be an ability to sell or an ability to move on from that property, and clearly staying close to that client so that you're there when they're ready to go the other direction is really important. So like I said, MASH Advisor, Investment Studio, these are all things I'll send, ways that you can use it. And then on the seller side, one thing to just keep in mind here in Arizona, and then I'll be done, is think about the idea here that in Arizona, again, the HOAs are a huge piece to it. They're the largest driver, and to put in HOAs or to buy properties that are short-term rentals and HOAs, I just would never do it. Or very rarely would I ever advise anybody to buy in there. It's just even if right now they allow them, it's too easy to go the other direction. Where if they get the HOA board approves the short-term rental, stay needs to increase to it like a 30-night minimum, which many of them are or have done or will do, that will absolutely kill the property. If you go to a 30-night minimum, the revenue expectations can easily drop 30 to 50%. So that's a massive difference. That's a different rental. It's not a short-term rental. In fact, in our business, we call that a long-term rental if it's a 30-day minimum. And it's difficult to either help buyers or sellers in that case, or even to come up with these numbers that they're going to need in order to make these properties pencil for them. So that was kind of what I would share. I know we're a little truncated on time, so I just don't want to get too deep into things that I can otherwise send to you in a deck if you're interested in. But I can take some questions, or Suzanne, you can tell me what the best thing to do is at this point, but I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Bobby. Is there any questions from the group out there? I'm not seeing any right now. I know you cover quite a bit of information that addresses a lot of things for investors. Maybe a question, since I'm not seeing anything in the chat, maybe a question for you. As far as demographics, do you see any particular nationality or country that we're seeing as far as people that are coming in and are the buyers of investment properties in Arizona? Is that
Sure.
Canadians or?
We don't see as many Canadians. The Canadian purchasing, if you will, a lot of that had to do with, kind of what the currency rate change is, right? So the exchange rate has a huge impact on that. A lot of Europeans right now, significant amount of Europeans that are coming in, French, a lot of French, Italian. There's some Asian buyers, especially folks that are divesting out of your traditionally higher Asian investment. So, like I said, I'm also the broker in Washington, so there's a huge heavy Asian influence up there. A lot of properties people are selling out of even their primary residences and taking the equity and buying down here. We've got about 5 or 6 people right now as we speak looking for properties that are even exchanges. And so that's a good point. I mean, one thing to think about, I know this isn't a class on FERPTA, but is to think about that when you're advising someone, talking with an escrow company or somebody that does the FERPTA piece to it is critical, especially in exchanges, because that could impact someone's ability to purchase. But I would say, if I was going to break it down, European, kind of the Mediterranean piece to it, we have a lot of folks coming in there from that area. And then domestically, there's a huge influx from the Northeast. Traditionally, it's always been the Midwest, Chicago, Wisconsin. And right now, we're seeing a lot of New York, Boston, a lot of East Coast, traditionally Northeast. And I don't know if that I wish I knew more. I don't know if that's because the Florida market is already a little more saturated. And so they're looking for other opportunities. And to be honest with you, I don't think it's a secret to anybody that has money in anywhere in the world that understands it's either Florida or Arizona right now that people are investing in. And so there's a ton of money coming this direction. But right now, I mean, a lot of the Eastern Europe, or pardon me, Western European countries are purchasing. Which, and actually maybe a better way to put that too on top of it is because there's a different floor plan, if you will, that people are kind of used to. There are a lot more or smaller properties that are being purchased, higher dollar amounts, but smaller properties. There has been a proclivity though to stay away from a lot of common elements. So the condos right now, or the anything that's high density has been, I mean, it's still selling, don't get me wrong, but there's a higher proclivity for people to look at properties that have their own pools. So when the pandemic happened, one of the things that a lot of purchaser and buyers were looking for, most of them came from colder markets, but a lot of the condos and some of the, and even a few of the co-ops that rent, they closed their pool. And that's all happened last year when it was 100 degrees for like 145 days straight or whatever. So purchasing properties that have their own pools has a lot more control than pools that didn't have their own. And believe it or not, that's what folks do the most when they come to Arizona, is sit in a hot tub or sit in a pool, besides watching TV, which is always funny. But yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, it is Western European. They are smaller formats, but they are in more of a single family residence space that they're looking for.
Right. Well, we do have a couple other questions that did pop up for you. One of them is March still the highest volume month for furnished rentals?
In terms of vacation demand, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I always say, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but just to try to illustrate just how the significance is I always say a trained monkey could rent a property in March in Arizona. So the reason that you have a property management company is to take care of that during that period, but then also to try to fill out the rest of the year. But March, I mean, March is such a high property. I mean, just put it in perspective. So in a 2-bedroom condo here in North Scottsdale, March could rent for, I mean, obviously it's broad range, but let's just say $3,500 to $4,500 a month. And then in a low season, it might rent for $1,500 a month. Something to that. I mean, extreme, if you will.
Yeah, well, it sounds about right. I mean, it's nice to see how much the rental market mirrors either the tourist market or our actual residential, more of your long-term rental market as well.
It was, oh, sorry. I was just going to piggyback on that. One thing that was really unique about this last March was that's when all the cancellations happened with the whole Airbnb and VRBO piece to it. And that crushed a lot of people financially because, again, they were looking for cash flow. Now, the unique part was, and I mean, just to be brutally honest, in our own company, like everybody we knew, we downsized prematurely, because then what happened in the beginning of May when we opened back up, we had so much business that we didn't have the people in place to take it on. So it was a huge drop in March, and then it was a huge recovery in May. And the May, June, July moving forward was probably 3 times higher than it's been in the past. So it picked back up on the summer that we usually would lose, but lost the March that we usually would have gained. So it was really a bizarre year.
Yeah, I can bet. And I do think just kind of going back to some of the pandemic stuff, I think what we saw as far as some of the trends is that because of the CDC restrictions and social distancing and what they had to do in order to accommodate clientele within the hotel industry, and it reduced a lot of their clientele as they were looking at some of those transition to the short-term rental market as a means to still vacation but be socially distanced. And I think that speaks to some of the trends. Can you concur with that?
Yeah, 100%. So, and a lot of it was the socially distanced. You're right. There was 2 sides of it. There was the government intervention that limited the socially distanced percentage of the hotel stays. But also there was the, the comfortability of folks feeling more comfortable being in their own space, that they could control who was there, who wasn't there. So it was kind of there was two things working that one of the things too to think about when we're working with investors, especially that come from other areas, whether it's other parts of the country, other parts of the world, is when we meet investors at prospective short-term rental properties, a lot of them, regardless of their background, want to meet in person. Very, very many of them want to read, which was a unique way to handle this last year, because like our company, based on our scale, had a lot of things in place, right? So one of the biggest reasons we closed down in April, and this was in Florida here, is we just didn't have enough PPE. So all of our housekeepers, all of the operations groups that would go in there, they wouldn't have, and there was new cleaning guidelines and all that. However, on the investor side, buyers coming into the area from, like I said, Europe, or we had Asian people, Asian groups that would fly in, and very many of them. I mean, this summer I probably met with 150 people that flew in from around the country, around the world, and just something to be aware of. None of them, actually, that's not true. One group from Seattle was very animate about wearing masks, and nobody else did, and nobody else wanted to. And so that was a really unique. Our operations would never deal with them, but so for me, or for realtors that are going to be engaging, I would say, whatever it is moving forward, is to set that parameter forward if you want that to happen. And that's a huge cultural thing. I think it's a big cultural thing when it came to well, talk to your broker or your company on how they want to deal with that, because
sounds like good advice, because it is kind of surprising to see that it is somewhat of a cultural perspective of those that are either investing or traveling, of what their stance is when it comes to the mask wearing. Of course, if you can set those protocols up front with them before they come out, of how the expectation is to be handled when they're in your property, that's very important to know. Which
that's a great point. I do, just to hammer home on that piece, is my perception of folks that came from Europe and Southeast Asia, as well as the northern markets, because of the lockdowns. When I thought that they would have wanted to wear masks when they met me. I always brought masks in my pocket. I didn't know how it was going to go, and I thought, and every time, and this happened dozens and dozens of times, and there's a number of them that even took offense by me wanting to wear a mask for multiple reasons, and not that I was a huge mask wearer if I didn't have to be, but when you don't know people that are coming from different parts of the world in a pandemic, your eyebrow raises a little bit when you're dealing with investors or buyers. And so to that point, is I wouldn't assume that, depending on where people come from, that you're always going to have this built-in presumption of how they want to interact, because I did that incorrectly dozens and dozens of times.
So good to know. Good tip and trick there. But along the lines of, you were talking about what you have as far as a team for the property management aspect of the short-term rentals. And one of the questions that we had raised in the chat was, how much does it tend to cost to pay a company to manage a property? Is this kind of a percentage, or are there levels of management, kind of pay per service, quality that you get at different levels? Can you talk about that?
Sure. So it does depend, usually depends on the market and depends on the size of the company. So ours is different because we cover the entire Phoenix Valley. We have corporate structure. Our housekeepers are employees. I mean, that's another thing to be aware of, is our housekeeping staff, and this was no secret. The vast majority are Hispanic, and the Hispanic culture or group got hit really bad with the pandemic this last summer. I mean, really bad. So from a short-term rental perspective, I mean, it was very difficult to get properties cleaned, because many of them, from a cultural as well as just from a factual, I guess you call it statistical, would just stop showing up. I mean, literally stop showing up. So a lot of the properties we took on had to do with, we were paying extra for labor, because just to get, people knew that they were in high demand. It paid extra for labor, and then even trying to, I would say, rank order what's the most important things to do were, I guess, we put properties to deal with and whatnot. So when you get into some of these full service, and that's what I would say, there's kind of two different companies out there. There's what I call a la carte property management on the ground. So owners want to be involved in some level, whether it's dropping off toilet paper or toiletries or soaps or whatever it ends up being. Or then you have the full service, which is ours, because most of our properties are cater foreign or out of area buyers. So, they're not dropping off, they're not running to Costco to drop things off. So in those percentages, usually it's a percent of the rent. So it could be anywhere from, and it just totally depends. I mean, on the low end, the a la carte could be, I've seen 15 to 20%. On the full service could be 20 to 35% of the rental amount. And then the startup cost is another piece that you'd have to think about. All these folks, you're going to want to get pictures. A lot of the 3D Matterports are huge because most people, when they rent, they don't walk the property, right? So the 3D walking through the property helps increases bookings by 20 to 30% based upon if you take two properties side by side, very similar amenities. One you can walk through Matterport, the other one is just still shots. Matterport statistically goes up 15, 20, some markets 30%. So that's huge to recognize that piece to it. But very, very, in Arizona, I would say coaching buyers and or being available or being able to set up your TPT taxes, set up your business licenses, set up your registrations. Those are all things that out of area buyers, even out of country buyers wouldn't know. And so that's where you would need a compliance or legal team that you'd want to work with. And so are you going to do that or are they going to do that? Right. And so that's where that cost differentiator is. But I would say broadly speaking, it's 15 to 35% of the rental revenue. So that's top line. So if it's $1,000 a night, that would be that percentage of there. Now that's different than usually the guest would be charged for cleaning fees. Usually the guest pays for the TPT taxes, which I'm on the, as Susan knows, on the Scottsdale short-term rental working group with Rebecca. And so there's a lot of things to learn with that. And a lot of, it's going to become more important to better the space that everyone follows the rules, I guess a good way to put it. So as a property management company, one of the ways that we can help stay in business and help our clients is to ensure that everything is done correctly. And
Right.
I think that's important.
Very important. Well put. I think what we were finding out across the state and with a lot of your hosts that participate in the short-term rental market is a lack of awareness on what the regulations are in the state of Arizona, not just on a state level, but on a municipality level, that with the requirement for you need to have a TPT license, you need to be registered with the county and or the city that the property resides in, that you need to be remitting the tax for the hotel's tax, the transitory tax for your short-term rentals, that if you're not submitting that and remitting it, you could be in violation. And we're of course awaiting some future legislation that might come out to further regulate the industry, because we're seeing too many hosts and practitioners that are not following the guidelines, not following the rules. And we want to make sure to establish an education practice for those, at least in the state of Arizona. I know I deal with this nationally with it's an issue across the country as far as different rules and regulations that they're trying to fight for basic guidelines for good operators throughout the country, so that you can keep this a viable industry and investment for our customers and clientele.
Yeah, and to that point, you're exactly right. One other thing to think about is, here's a perfect example of where property managers could help out. And I think the education point is critical, is because that's what a lot of folks, based upon some of the limitations that cities have, is in talking with even some of the city enforcement group, is usually when owners are told, here's what's wrong, all of them fix it. Problem is they just don't know what's wrong. And that's something where the Realtor Association